The girl's hands trembled as she stood before the mahogany desk in the study, the dead woman's jewelry box open before her, speaking aloud the contents in perfect detail. Items she should never have seen, words she should never have known, in a language a 7-year-old slave child had no right to possess. Across from her, the plantation mistress's 3 adult children sat frozen, their faces drained of color because little Celia had just recited their mother's will, word for word, including the secret codicil hidden in a locked drawer written in French that none of them had yet discovered. The room fell into a silence so complete that the ticking of the grandfather clock sounded like thunder because what they were witnessing was impossible, unless the stories the house slaves whispered were true, unless the boundary between the living and the dead was thinner than white folks believed, unless this child was something more than what she appeared to be. Before we continue with Celia's impossible knowledge and the dangerous revelation that would either save or destroy her, I need you to understand something critical about what you're about to hear. This is not just another story from the past. This is about memory, inheritance, and the supernatural bonds that slavery could not sever. If you believe that the dead speak, that children can carry the voices of those who came before, that justice sometimes requires a haunting, then subscribe to this channel right now. Comment, remember if you're ready to hear how a child became a bridge between worlds. And tell me where you're watching from, because this story belongs to all of us who understand that some debts transcend death itself. Now let's go back to how this began, because Celia's gift didn't start with that moment in the study. It started 3 months earlier, on the day Madame Beaumont died. Oakwood Plantation, St. Mary Parish, Louisiana, April 1867. The war had been over for 2 years, but freedom remained a word with flexible meaning in the sugar country, where the old families still controlled the land, the law, and the lives of those who worked their fields. Madame Geneviève Beaumont had ruled Oakwood for 43 years, from the day she married Philippa Beaumont in 1824 until the morning she died in her canopied bed, her fingers clutching a rosary, her lips moving in silent prayer or perhaps final curses. She was 71 years old. She had owned, at various times, 147 human beings. She had sold 32 of them south when prices were high. She had ordered the whipping of countless others. She had separated mothers from children, husbands from wives, siblings from siblings, with the stroke of a pen and the indifference of someone selecting which chickens to slaughter for Sunday dinner. But Madame Beaumont had also been a woman of contradictions, and it was these contradictions that would echo through Celia's voice in ways that would terrify everyone who heard them. The mistress had kept meticulous records not just of property and profits, but of secrets. She had written 3 journals in French, her native language, documenting not the public history of Oakwood, but its shadow history. The children her husband had fathered with enslaved women, the debts hidden from her sons, the land parcels she had quietly purchased in her own name, the gold she had buried in locations known only to her, and most dangerously, the truth about the parentage of several prominent white families in the parish, whose bloodlines were not as pure as their social standing suggested. These journals were her insurance, her power, her final weapon against a world that would have preferred her silent and obedient. She had hidden them in 3 separate locations within the house, telling no one, trusting no one, because Madame Beaumont understood that knowledge was the only currency that never devalued. Celia was born in the quarters in 1860, the daughter of Josephine, a house servant who had worked in the Beaumont household since she was 12 years old. Celia's father was unknown, or rather, unacknowledged, though the house slaves knew and the field slaves suspected, and Madame Beaumont had written the truth in her second journal in an entry dated November 1859. The child was small for her age, quiet, watchful, with eyes that seemed older than her years, and a stillness that unnerved the other children. She did not play. She did not laugh often. She moved through the big house like a shadow, performing the small tasks assigned to children too young for field work, carrying water, fetching items, standing ready to fan flies away from the dining table, holding the mistress's sewing basket while Madame Beaumont worked her needle through expensive fabric. It was during these hours of silent attendance that something began to happen, something that Celia herself did not understand and could not explain. She began to hear the mistress's thoughts, not as words exactly, but as knowings, as certainties that appeared in her mind fully formed, complete with details and contexts she had never been taught. When Madame Beaumont looked at her pearl necklace, Celia knew it had been a gift from the mistress's mother in Paris, given on her 16th birthday, and that Madame Beaumont had pawned and reclaimed it twice during lean years. When the mistress wrote letters, Celia could sense the contents before the ink dried, could feel the emotions behind the formal language, could understand the French words, despite having no education in that language or any other. When Madame Beaumont walked through her garden, Celia knew which plants held memories of the mistress's youth, which paths she had walked with lovers, which benches had witnessed her tears. The house slaves noticed that Celia knew things she shouldn't know. She would fetch items before being asked. She would appear in rooms moments before the mistress called for her. She would avoid the mistress on days when Madame Beaumont's temper was particularly foul, and stay close on days when the old woman's loneliness made her almost kind. Josephine, Celia's mother, watched this development with growing fear because she understood that being noticed was dangerous for a slave child, and being strange was potentially fatal. She warned Celia to hide her knowing, to pretend ignorance, to never speak of what she sensed. Celia tried to obey, but the knowing grew stronger, not weaker, and by the winter of 1866, the child could sense not just Madame Beaumont's thoughts, but her memories, her regrets, her secrets, as if the old woman's mind was a book that Celia could read without opening. Then, in April 1867, Madame Beaumont died. The death was expected. She had been declining for months, her body failing while her mind remained sharp and bitter to the end. The family gathered her 3 surviving children, Auguste, Marguerite, and Philippe Jr., along with their spouses and the lawyer from New Orleans who had managed the Beaumont affairs for 2 decades. There was a will, everyone knew, but its contents were a mystery because Madame Beaumont had insisted on absolute secrecy, had met with the lawyer alone, had sealed the document herself. The reading was scheduled for 1 week after the funeral, giving the family time to mourn and the lawyer time to ensure all parties were present. But on the night Madame Beaumont died, something happened to Celia that would change everything. She was sleeping in the small room off the kitchen where the house servants' children slept when she woke suddenly, completely, with a clarity that felt like being born. The room was dark, but she could see perfectly. The air was still, but she could feel a presence, a weight, a consciousness that was not her own but was somehow intimately familiar. And then she heard the voice, not with her ears but inside her mind, speaking in French and English simultaneously, speaking with Madame Beaumont's precise diction and imperious tone, speaking words that would possess Celia for the next 3 months. "Child," the voice said, "you have been my witness. Now you will be my voice. They will try to bury my truth with my body. You will not let them. You know where I have hidden what matters. You know what I have written. You know who has lied and who has stolen and who has pretended. When the time comes, you will speak. You will tell them everything. They will not believe you at first, but you will prove it to them, and they will have no choice but to hear me through you. This is not a gift I give you, child. This is a burden, but you are strong enough to carry it, because you have carried me all these years without breaking. Do not be afraid. The dead have power the living cannot imagine, and I will protect you as I never protected anyone in life. Speak when the moment comes. Speak with my voice. Speak my truth." The presence faded, but the knowledge remained, and Celia understood with terrible certainty that she now carried not just Madame Beaumont's memories, but her entire consciousness, her complete archive of secrets, her unfinished business with the living. The child lay awake until dawn, her small body rigid with fear and purpose, knowing that something had been transferred to her, something that would make her either invaluable or expendable, depending on how the White family chose to interpret what was about to happen. The week between the death and the will reading was chaos. The Beaumont children searched the house systematically, looking for hidden documents, secret caches of money, anything their mother might have concealed. They found nothing because Madame Beaumont had been too clever, had hidden her treasures too well, had anticipated exactly this ransacking. They questioned the house slaves, but no one knew anything or claimed not to know, because talking about the mistress's secrets was a quick path to being sold, or worse. They brought in a locksmith to open the mistress's desk, her trunks, her jewelry boxes, finding only ordinary items, nothing that explained the rumors of hidden wealth that had circulated through the parish for years. Celia watched all of this from her usual position of invisible servitude, carrying trays, emptying chamber pots, standing in corners while the White family argued. She said nothing, but she knew everything. She knew that the gold was buried beneath the third rose bush in the east garden, wrapped in oilcloth, totaling $4,000 in coins. She knew that the first journal was hidden in a hollowed-out book in the library, a French novel that no one had opened in 20 years. She knew that the second journal was sewn into the lining of the mistress's winter cloak hanging in the wardrobe. She knew that the third journal was in the attic, inside a hat box labeled 1843, containing not hats but the most dangerous secrets of all. She knew the contents of the will, including the codicil that would shock the family. Madame Beaumont had left a portion of the estate to Josephine and Celia, acknowledging in writing what she had never acknowledged in life, that Celia was her granddaughter, the child of Philippe Jr. and Josephine, conceived during one of the young master's drunken visits to the quarters in 1859. The will reading was scheduled for April 15, 1867 in the study, with all family members present. But 2 days before that date, something happened that forced Celia's hand and brought the haunting into the open. Philippe Jr., drunk and angry about his mother's death and his own financial troubles, accused Josephine of stealing a silver serving platter. It was a false accusation motivated by spite and the desire to assert dominance in a household where the power structure was shifting. He demanded that Josephine be whipped as an example, despite the fact that slavery was legally ended, despite the fact that such punishment was now technically illegal, because in St. Mary Parish in 1867, the law was whatever white men with land said it was. Celia was in the kitchen when she heard her mother's cry, when she saw Philippe Jr. dragging Josephine toward the barn where the whipping post still stood, a relic of the old order that no one had bothered to remove. Something broke open inside the child, some final barrier between her own consciousness and the voice that had possessed her. She ran after them, her small legs pumping, her voice rising in a shout that stopped Philippe Jr. in his tracks, because what came out of Celia's mouth was not a child's voice, but Madame Beaumont's voice, speaking in French, speaking with absolute authority, speaking words that made the young master drop his mother's arm and stare at the child as if she had transformed into a ghost before his eyes. "Philippe Armand Beaumont Jr.," Celia said in perfect French, in the exact cadence and tone of his dead mother, "you will release that woman immediately, or I will tell your wife about Marie-Claire Devereux and the child you fathered with her in 1863. The child your mother paid $500 to have sent to Mobile. The child whose existence would destroy your marriage and your standing in this parish. You will release her now, and you will never touch her again, because that woman is the mother of your daughter, and this child standing before you is your own blood, and I will not allow you to compound your sins with violence against your own family." Felipe Jr. stood frozen, his face cycling through shock, denial, rage, and finally fear, because how could this child know these things? How could she speak in his mother's voice? How could she recite secrets that only his mother had known? He released Josephine's arm. He stepped back. He looked at Celia with an expression that mixed terror and hatred, because he was a man who believed in ghosts, who had been raised on stories of hauntings and possessions, who understood that the dead in Louisiana did not always stay buried. He turned and walked back to the house without another word, leaving Josephine and Celia standing in the yard, the mother staring at her daughter with a mixture of pride and absolute terror. That night the house was in uproar. Philippe Jr. told his siblings what had happened, and they convened an emergency meeting, calling in the lawyer early, demanding to know what was happening, whether the child was possessed, whether she was dangerous, whether she should be sent away or silenced permanently. The lawyer, a pragmatic man named Etienne Marchand, suggested a test. If the child truly carried Madame Beaumont's knowledge, she would be able to prove it. If she was simply repeating things she had overheard, she would fail under questioning. They would bring her into the study, ask her specific questions that only Madame Beaumont could answer, and determine the truth. The test was scheduled for the following morning, April 14th, 1867. Celia was brought into the study, where the three Beaumont children sat in judgment, with lawyer Marchand taking notes and Josephine standing in the corner, her hands clasped in prayer. The room smelled of old leather and tobacco, and the lingering scent of Madame Beaumont's lavender perfume. The morning light came through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like spirits in the air. Celia stood before the mahogany desk, her small frame dwarfed by the furniture, her face calm in a way that unnerved everyone watching. Auguste Beaumont, the eldest son, spoke first. He was a serious man, a former Confederate officer who had lost an arm at Shiloh and his faith in everything else during the long retreat. "Child," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "my brother claims you spoke in our mother's voice and revealed secrets only she knew. I do not believe in ghosts or possessions. I believe you overheard conversations and are repeating them for attention or some other purpose. I will ask you 3 questions. If you answer them correctly, with details that prove you could not have simply overheard them, I will consider that you may be telling the truth. If you fail, you and your mother will be sent away from Oakwood immediately. Do you understand?" Celia nodded. The voice inside her was quiet now, waiting, but she could feel its presence like a second heartbeat, like a hand on her shoulder, like a whisper in her ear that said, "Tell them. Tell them everything. Make them hear." Auguste's first question: "What was the name of my mother's childhood dog in Paris, and how did it die?" Celia closed her eyes, and the answer came instantly, complete with images and emotions that were not her own. "His name was Beau," she said, speaking in English but with a slight French accent that had never been in her voice before. "He was a King Charles Spaniel, black and white, with one ear that folded wrong. Your mother got him when she was 8 years old in 1804, from her uncle who bred dogs for the aristocracy. Beau died when she was 12, hit by a carriage on Rue Saint-Honoré while chasing a cat. Your mother held him while he died, and she never forgave herself for letting him off the leash. She kept his collar in a box in her room until she married and moved to Louisiana. The collar is still in that box, in the attic, in a trunk marked Paris 1820. The leather is cracked now, but you can still see where she embroidered his name in gold thread. The room went silent. Augusta's face had gone pale because this was not common knowledge. This was not something the child could have overheard. This was a story his mother had told him once, when he was young, when she was in a rare mood of vulnerability, and he had never heard her speak of it again. He looked at his siblings, who looked back with equal shock. Marguerite Beaumont Dufresne, the middle child, spoke next. She was a hard woman, made harder by a loveless marriage and the loss of 3 children in infancy. "If you truly carry our mother's knowledge," she said, her voice sharp as broken glass, "then tell me what she wrote in her diary on the day of my wedding. Tell me the exact words." Celia's eyes were still closed. She swayed slightly, as if the weight of the memories was physical. When she spoke, her voice had changed again, becoming older, more refined, tinged with sadness. June 14th, 1848. "Today I gave my daughter to a man I do not trust, to a family I do not respect, because her father insisted, and because a woman's duty is to marry well, not to marry happily. Marguerite wore my grandmother's veil, and she looked beautiful, and I saw in her eyes that she knows what I know, that this marriage is a prison sentence. I wanted to tell her to run, to refuse, to choose poverty over misery. But I said nothing, because I am a coward, because I made the same choice 34 years ago, and I have no right to ask her to be braver than I was. God forgive me for what I have done to my daughter. God forgive me for valuing reputation over her happiness. She will hate me for this one day, and she will be right to hate me." Marguerite made a sound like a wounded animal, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears, because these were words she had never heard, words her mother had never spoken aloud, words that validated every bitter feeling she had carried for 19 years. She stood abruptly and left the room, unable to bear the weight of this posthumous confession. Philippe Jr., the youngest and the most frightened, asked the third question, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me what our mother knew about my daughter. Tell me what she wrote about Celia." The child opened her eyes and looked directly at her father, and in that moment, everyone in the room could see Madame Beaumont looking out through those young eyes, could feel the presence of the dead woman as if she were standing among them. Celia spoke, and the words came in French first, then English, as if the ghost needed both languages to express the full weight of what she had to say. November 12th, 1859. "My son has committed the same sin his father committed before him, and I am complicit in this generational curse because I have said nothing, done nothing, allowed the pattern to continue. Josephine is pregnant with Philippa's child, and I know this because I see the way she moves, the way she avoids his eyes, the way she carries shame like a cloak. I should send her away, protect her, give her money and freedom and a chance to raise this child far from here, but I am selfish and I am cruel, and I want to see this child because she will be my granddaughter, the only grandchild I will ever have. From Philippe, because his wife is barren and he is too weak to leave her. So I will keep Josephine here, and I will watch this child grow, and I will know her in ways I cannot know my legitimate grandchildren, because this child will be mine in ways they never can be. I will call her Celia, after my own grandmother, and I will give her what protection I can, without acknowledging what she is. This is my sin, my secret, my final rebellion against a world that would deny her existence. Let God judge me for it. I am beyond caring what men think." The study erupted into chaos. Philippe Jr. was shouting denials, then admissions, then justifications. Auguste was demanding to see the journals to verify these claims. Lawyer Marchand was frantically taking notes, understanding that the legal implications of this revelation were staggering. Josephine had collapsed to her knees, weeping because the secret she had carried for 8 years was now spoken aloud, was now undeniable, was now a fact that would reshape the entire family structure. But Celia was not finished. The voice inside her was insistent now, pushing her to complete the revelation, to speak all the truths that Madame Beaumont had died protecting. She walked to the bookshelf, pulled down the French novel, opened it to reveal the hollowed-out interior and the leather journal hidden within. She placed it on the desk. She walked to the wardrobe, retrieved the winter cloak, and with small fingers that seemed guided by invisible hands, she found the seam in the lining and pulled out the second journal. She placed it beside the first. Then she spoke the location of the third journal, the one in the attic, and the location of the buried gold, and the contents of the secret codicil that lawyer Marchand had not yet revealed. The will, Celia said, in Madame Beaumont's voice, leaves the house and primary lands to Auguste, as is proper for the eldest son. It leaves the sugar mill and equipment to Philippe, though he will mismanage it within 5 years. It leaves the New Orleans property to Marguerite, though her husband will try to claim it. But the codicil, written 3 days before my death, leaves $4,000 in gold to Josephine, to be held in trust for Celia's education and future. It acknowledges Celia as my granddaughter and Philippe's daughter. It requires that she be given the family name if she chooses to claim it. It states that if any family member contests this provision, the entirety of the estate will be donated to the Freedmen's Bureau for the establishment of schools for colored children in St. Mary Parish. This is my final will, my final act, my final attempt to balance the scales I tipped so far toward injustice during my life. Lawyer Marchand opened his case with shaking hands and retrieved the sealed codicil. He broke the seal and read it aloud, and every word matched what Celia had spoken. The room fell into a silence so profound that the ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to mark not seconds, but the collapse of an entire social order. The legal battle that followed lasted 3 months. The Beaumont children tried to contest the codicil, claiming their mother had been mentally incompetent, claiming Celia was a fraud, claiming the whole thing was a conspiracy orchestrated by Josephine and the lawyer. But Celia's knowledge proved impossible to explain away. She could recite passages from all 3 journals. She could describe events from Madame Beaumont's childhood that no one else alive knew. She could speak in French with perfect grammar and vocabulary she had never been taught. She could answer questions about family history, financial transactions, and personal secrets with accuracy that could only come from Madame Beaumont herself. The case drew attention from across Louisiana. Newspapers sent reporters. The Freedmen's Bureau sent observers. The Catholic Church sent a priest to determine if this was demonic possession or divine intervention. Scientists came to study the child, to test her, to try to find a rational explanation for her abilities. Some claimed she was a medium, a natural conduit for spirits. Others claimed she had an extraordinary memory and had somehow absorbed information without conscious awareness. Still others believed she was exactly what she appeared to be, a child possessed by her grandmother's ghost, carrying out the old woman's final mission of truth-telling and restitution. Through it all, Celia remained calm, answering questions, providing evidence, speaking in 2 voices, her own and Madame Beaumont's, as the situation required. Josephine stood beside her daughter, terrified but proud, understanding that this strange gift was both protection and danger, both salvation and curse. The house slaves watched in amazement as a 7-year-old child brought the Beaumont family to its knees, as she forced them to acknowledge truths they had spent lifetimes denying, as she redistributed power and property through the sheer force of impossible knowledge. The court ruled in Celia's favor in July 1867. The codicil was upheld. The gold was transferred to a trust managed by the Freedmen's Bureau. Josephine and Celia were given legal freedom papers. though they had technically been free since 1865, and they were granted the right to remain at Oakwood or leave as they chose. Philippe Jr. was forced to acknowledge Celia as his daughter, though he did so with bitterness and resentment that would poison their relationship forever. The journals were sealed by court order, their full contents kept secret to protect the living from the dead woman's complete honesty, though excerpts were read into the record to establish Celia's credibility. But the most important outcome was not legal or financial. It was the precedent, the story, the legend that spread through the freedmen's communities across the South. Here was a child who had used the master's own words against him, who had turned the mistress's secrets into weapons of liberation, who had proven that the dead could speak through the living to demand justice. Here was evidence that the boundary between worlds was permeable, that the ancestors were watching, that truth could not be buried, even when those who knew it were in graves. Celia's gift did not fade after the trial. For the rest of her life, she would occasionally speak in Madame Beaumont's voice, would know things she had no natural way of knowing, would serve as a bridge between the living and the dead. She used this ability carefully, strategically, helping other freedmen recover property, prove family connections, and navigate the legal complexities of Reconstruction. She became known as the child who remembers, and people would travel days to consult with her, to ask her to contact their own dead, to seek guidance from ancestors who had passed beyond the veil. She learned to read and write, using the trust fund to attend a school established by Northern missionaries. She studied French formally, discovering that she already knew the language perfectly, that Madame Beaumont's consciousness had given her not just memories but complete linguistic competence. She read the journals in their entirety when she turned 18, learning the full scope of her grandmother's crimes and contradictions, her cruelties and her occasional mercies, her complicity in slavery and her final attempt at redemption. In 1875, at age 15, Celia wrote her own account of the possession, the trial, and the years that followed. She wrote it in both English and French, in her own voice and in Madame Beaumont's voice, creating a dual narrative that captured the complexity of their relationship. The living child and the dead grandmother, the enslaved and the enslaver, the victim and the perpetrator, bound together by blood and by a supernatural connection that neither had chosen, but both had used for purposes larger than themselves. The document, titled Two Voices, One Truth, a testament of memory and justice, was deposited with the Freedmen's Bureau and later transferred to the archives of the Louisiana Historical Society. It remains one of the most extraordinary first-hand accounts of the immediate post-war period, a document that challenges conventional understandings of memory, inheritance, and the persistence of consciousness beyond death. Celia married in 1880 to a teacher named Samuel Morrison, a free-born black man from Philadelphia who had come south to work in the freedmen's schools. They had 4 children, and Celia raised them with stories of Madame Beaumont, not to glorify the old woman, but to teach her children about the complexity of history, about the ways that oppressors and oppressed are sometimes bound together by blood and circumstance, about the importance of speaking truth even when that truth is uncomfortable or dangerous. She never returned to Oakwood Plantation after 1870, when she and Josephine left for New Orleans. The Beaumont family sold the property in 1873, unable to maintain it without slave labor and unwilling to adapt to the new economic realities of free labor. The house fell into disrepair and was eventually demolished in 1891. But before it was destroyed, Celia visited one final time, walking through the empty rooms, touching the walls, standing in the study where she had revealed her impossible knowledge. She reported that she could still feel Madame Beaumont's presence, could still hear the whisper of that imperious voice, could still sense the weight of all those secrets that had been spoken aloud and could never be unspoken. "She is still here," Celia told a reporter, who accompanied her on that final visit. Not haunting exactly, but lingering, watching, waiting to see if the truth she forced me to tell will make any difference in the end. I tell her it will, that it already has, that every child who learns to read because of the schools her money helped build is a victory over the system she served. I tell her that redemption is possible, even for those who committed terrible sins, as long as they are willing to face the truth of what they did. I tell her that I forgive her, not because she deserves forgiveness, but because carrying hatred is too heavy a burden for the living. And sometimes, when the house is very quiet, I think I hear her say thank you. Or perhaps that is just my own voice, my own need to believe that even the dead can change, can grow, can learn to be better than they were in life. Celia died in 1932 at the age of 72, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. Her mind, clear until the end. Her last words, spoken in French, were reported by her eldest daughter. Je suis libre. Nous sommes libres. Enfin, I am free. We are free. Finally. Whether she was speaking for herself or for Madame Beaumont or for both of them together, no one could say. The trust fund that Madame Beaumont established for Celia's education was never fully depleted. Celia used portions of it to fund her own children's education, and she established a scholarship fund for Black students in St. Mary Parish that continued to operate until 1965, when it was absorbed into a larger civil rights era educational foundation. In total, the fund supported the education of over 300 students across 3 generations, a legacy that far exceeded the $4,000 in gold that had been its seed money. The 3 journals of Madame Beaumont were kept sealed by court order until 1917, 50 years after the trial. When they were finally opened and transcribed, they revealed a portrait of plantation life that was both more brutal and more complicated than most historical accounts of the period. Madame Beaumont had documented not just her own family's sins, but the sins of dozens of prominent Louisiana families, creating a shadow history of the antebellum South that challenged the romantic narratives that were already beginning to dominate popular memory. Historians have debated the journal's authenticity, with some claiming that Celia herself must have written them, using her supernatural knowledge to create a posthumous confession that served her own political purposes. But handwriting analysis, paper dating, and the testimony of those who knew Madame Beaumont all confirmed that the journals were genuine, that they were written over a period of 40 years, and that they represent one of the most unflinching self-examinations by a slave-owning woman in American history. The case of Celia and Madame Beaumont raises questions that remain unresolved to this day. Was Celia truly possessed by her grandmother's ghost, or did she have an extraordinary form of genetic memory, a biological inheritance of knowledge that science has yet to explain? Was the possession a supernatural event? Or was it a psychological phenomenon, a dissociative state that allowed Celia to access information she had absorbed unconsciously during her years of silent observation? Was Madame Beaumont's final act an attempt at redemption, or was it simply a desire to control events even after death, to ensure that her version of the truth would be the one that survived? These questions cannot be answered definitively, but they point to larger truths about memory, inheritance, and the ways that the past refuses to stay buried. Celia's story demonstrates that the children of the enslaved carried knowledge that their oppressors believed they could not possess, that the boundaries between master and slave were more permeable than the law acknowledged, and that the dead, whether literally or metaphorically, continue to speak through the living, demanding that their truths be heard and their debts be paid. In the years since Celia's death, her story has been told and retold, adapted and interpreted, claimed by spiritualists as evidence of life after death. by psychologists as a case study in dissociative identity, by historians as a unique window into the consciousness of both the enslaved and the enslaver, and by activists as a parable about the power of speaking truth to power, even when that truth comes from beyond the grave. The Freedmen's Bureau records from 1867 include a note from the agent who oversaw Celia's case. "I have witnessed many extraordinary things in my years working with the freed people of Louisiana, but nothing has shaken my understanding of the possible quite like this child. Whether she is possessed, gifted, or simply extraordinarily perceptive, she has accomplished something remarkable. She has forced a white family to acknowledge their own sins, to pay restitution to those they wronged, and to accept a black child as their legal kin. If this is what the dead can accomplish through the living, then perhaps there is hope for justice after all, even in a world as broken as ours." The question of Celia's gift extends beyond the supernatural to the political and the moral. In a society built on the denial of black humanity, on the erasure of black knowledge, on the silencing of black voices, what did it mean for a 7-year-old black girl to speak with the authority of a white plantation mistress? What did it mean for her to use that voice, not to uphold the system, but to dismantle it, to redistribute wealth, to acknowledge kinship, to force the recognition of truths that the law and custom had worked to suppress? Celia's story is also a story about the relationship between mothers and daughters across the color line, about the ways that slavery created intimacies that were both genuine and grotesque, about the possibility and the limits of cross-racial solidarity in a system designed to prevent it. Madame Beaumont's decision to possess Celia, if we accept that interpretation, was an act of trust, a belief that this child could carry her voice, could use her secrets wisely, could accomplish in death what the mistress had been too cowardly to attempt in life. But it was also an act of violence, an imposition of one consciousness onto another, a continuation of the pattern of white people using black bodies for their own purposes, even if those purposes were ostensibly benevolent. Celia never chose to be possessed. She never asked for the burden of carrying her grandmother's guilt and secrets. The gift that saved her and her mother was also a curse that marked her as strange, as other, as someone who could never fully belong to either the world of the living or the world of the dead, to either the black community or the white family. Yet Celia herself seemed to understand her role with remarkable clarity. In her 1875 account, she wrote, "I am the bridge that neither side wanted, but both sides needed. I am the proof that the dead do not forget, that debts must be paid, that truth will find a voice, even if it must speak through the mouth of a child. I did not choose this gift, but I have chosen what to do with it. I have chosen to use it for liberation, for education, for the building of a future where children like me will not need to carry the voices of the dead, because the living will have learned to speak truth themselves." This vision of a future where supernatural intervention is unnecessary because justice has become natural is perhaps the most radical aspect of Celia's story. She did not glorify her gift or seek to perpetuate it. She used it strategically for a specific historical moment, and then she worked to create conditions where such gifts would no longer be needed. She educated her children in both the supernatural and the practical, teaching them to honor the ancestors while building institutions that would serve the living. The schools that Madame Beaumont's money helped to build were part of a broader network of Freedmen's Bureau schools that educated over 250,000 black children in the South between 1865 and 1870. These schools faced constant opposition from white Southerners who understood that education was a threat to the racial hierarchy they were trying to rebuild after the war. Teachers were attacked, schools were burned, students were intimidated. But the schools persisted, and they laid the foundation for the Black educational institutions that would nurture the leaders of the civil rights movement a century later. Celia's contribution to this effort was both material and symbolic. The money from the trust fund built 3 schools in St. Mary Parish, schools that operated until the 1890s, when the rise of Jim Crow laws and the withdrawal of federal support made it impossible to sustain them. But the symbolic power of her story, the story of a child who used the master's own words to win freedom and resources, inspired countless other freedmen to fight for their rights, to demand acknowledgement of their humanity, to refuse to accept the new forms of oppression that were being constructed to replace slavery. The legal precedent set by Celia's case was also significant. The court's willingness to accept her testimony, despite her age and race and the supernatural nature of her claims, represented a brief moment of possibility in the Reconstruction era, a moment when the legal system seemed open to recognizing Black people as credible witnesses, as bearers of truth, as entitled to justice. This moment did not last. Within a decade, the courts would be systematically stripping away the rights that had been won during Reconstruction. But the precedent remained in the records, a reminder that things had once been different, that they could be different again. The story of Celia and Madame Beaumont also speaks to the question of what we owe to the dead and what the dead owe to us. Madame Beaumont spent her life accumulating power and wealth through the exploitation of enslaved people. She participated in a system of extraordinary violence and injustice. Yet in her final act, she attempted to make amends, to redistribute some of what she had stolen, to acknowledge truths she had spent a lifetime denying. Was this enough? Can deathbed conversions and posthumous confessions balance the scales of a lifetime of sin? Celia's answer, as expressed in her writings and her life, seems to be, no, it is not enough, but it is something. It is a beginning. It is better than silence, better than denial, better than the perpetuation of lies. Madame Beaumont's final act did not erase her crimes, but it created possibilities for the future that would not have existed otherwise. It gave Celia and Josephine resources and recognition that they could use to build better lives. It forced the Beaumont family to confront uncomfortable truths. It contributed to the education of hundreds of children who would otherwise have remained illiterate. This pragmatic approach to justice, taking what can be gotten, using it for good, while never forgetting or excusing the original sin, is characteristic of the freedmen's generation, who had to navigate a world where perfect justice was impossible, but partial justice was worth fighting for. They could not undo slavery, could not bring back the dead, could not erase the trauma, but they could build schools, establish families, create institutions, and tell stories that would preserve the truth for future generations. The preservation of truth is perhaps the most important legacy of Celia's story. In the decades after Reconstruction, as the lost cause mythology took hold and the history of slavery was rewritten to minimize its horrors and glorify the plantation system, stories like Celia's served as counter-narratives, as evidence that the reality had been far different from the romantic fiction. The journals of Madame Beaumont, with their unflinching documentation of cruelty and exploitation, could not be dismissed as abolitionist propaganda or Northern bias. They were written by a Southern white woman, a slave owner, someone who had every reason to lie or minimize, but who chose instead to tell the truth, at least to herself, and eventually to posterity. This truth-telling was dangerous then and remains controversial now. There are those who would prefer that stories like Celia's remain buried, who argue that focusing on the horrors of slavery is divisive, that it prevents healing and reconciliation, that it perpetuates grievances that should be forgotten. But Celia's story demonstrates that there can be no healing without truth. no reconciliation without acknowledgement, no moving forward without understanding what happened and why it happened and who was responsible. The question of responsibility is central to Celia's narrative. Madame Beaumont was responsible for her own actions, but she was also part of a larger system that shaped her choices and limited her options. She was both perpetrator and product, both agent and instrument. This complexity does not excuse her crimes, but it helps explain them, and it points to the systemic nature of injustice, the ways that individual sins are embedded in larger structures of power and oppression. Celia herself was both victim and victor, both powerless child and powerful medium, both inheritor of trauma and agent of transformation. She did not choose her circumstances, but she chose how to respond to them. She used the tools available to her, her supernatural gift, her intelligence, her courage, and the legal possibilities of the Reconstruction moment to create change that extended far beyond her own life. The relationship between Celia and Madame Beaumont is a relationship between generations, between races, between the living and the dead, between oppressor and oppressed. It is a relationship that should not have existed, that was created by violence and exploitation, but that became, in its strange way, a vehicle for justice and transformation. This is not to romanticize the relationship or to suggest that good can come from evil without cost. The cost to Celia was enormous. The burden of carrying another consciousness, the trauma of being marked as strange, the loss of a normal childhood, the weight of responsibility for using her gift wisely. But Celia bore that cost and used it to create something valuable, something that outlasted both her own life and the life of the woman who possessed her. She created a legacy of education, of truth-telling, of resistance to erasure. She proved that the voices of the enslaved could not be silenced, that the dead could speak through the living, that justice could be demanded and sometimes won, even in the most unlikely circumstances. The story ends, as all stories must, with questions for the living. What voices from the past are we failing to hear? What truths are we refusing to acknowledge? What debts remain unpaid? What knowledge do we carry that we have not yet found the courage to speak aloud? What gifts have we been given, whether we wanted them or not? And how will we choose to use them? Celia's story asks us to consider the possibility that the boundary between past and present is more permeable than we imagine, that the dead are not silent but simply waiting for someone to listen, that the work of justice is never finished because each generation inherits the unresolved conflicts of the previous generation and must decide whether to perpetuate them or transform them. It asks us to honor the ancestors, not by idealizing them or excusing their sins, but by telling the truth about them, by learning from their mistakes and their victories, by continuing the work they began and could not finish. It asks us to recognize that we are all, in some sense, bridges between the past and the future, carriers of voices and memories that are not entirely our own, responsible for using what we have inherited, whether it is money or knowledge or trauma or gifts, in ways that serve liberation and justice. And it asks us to remember that children see and hear and know more than adults believe they do, that the powerless often possess knowledge that the powerful would prefer to keep hidden, and that speaking truth, even when that truth is impossible or dangerous or comes from beyond the grave, is sometimes the most powerful act of resistance available to those who have been denied all other forms of power. So I ask you now, what impossible knowledge are you carrying? What truths have you been afraid to speak? What voices from the past are asking you to be their bridge to the future? Comment below and tell me what you think about Celia's story. Was she truly possessed, or was this an extraordinary case of inherited memory? Do you believe the dead can speak through the living? Have you ever experienced something that made you question the boundary between this world and the next? And most importantly, what are you going to do with the knowledge and the gifts you have inherited, whether you chose them or not? Subscribe to this channel if you want to hear more stories about the people who refused to be erased, who spoke truth even when silence was safer, who used whatever tools they had, supernatural or natural, legal or illegal, conventional or impossible, to fight for freedom and dignity and justice. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, someone who is carrying burdens they did not choose, someone who is trying to figure out how to use their gifts for good in a world that often seems determined to suppress truth and perpetuate injustice. Remember Celia. Remember Madame Beaumont. Remember Josephine. Remember all the voices that have been silenced and all the voices that refuse to stay silent. Remember that the dead are watching, that the ancestors are waiting, that the work of justice is never finished, and that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply to tell the truth, to speak what we know, to be the bridge that neither side wanted, but both sides needed. The past is not dead. It is not even past. It lives in us, speaks through us, demands that we pay attention and take action. Celia understood this. She lived it. She used it to change the world, one impossible truth at a time. Now it is our turn to listen, to speak, to remember, and to act. What will you do with your inheritance? What truth will you speak? What bridge will you become?